That Kathy, she's at it again. So after a lot of tedious hours filming me building the birch bark canoe, she decided she put together a compilation of the entire build start to finish instead of all those short little segments, similar to the one she did for our cabin build here. So this is the first year in over 20 that we're not hunting moose with guns. We've decided we're going hunting with a camera. And well, Kathy's the cinematographer. She's the one on the end of the camera, and I'll be the one doing the paddling to get her close, I hope. And over the years of hunting, I've got fairly handy at talking moose, so I can call them in, and it's going to be rather fun. But the best part of this is we're actually going to put the new canoe build to the test, so it's first trip. So we're going late September, early October. That's the height of the rut for moose and the time when one can fairly easily call them into close range. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about that. Our moose hunts, typically we go way north in northern Ontario, north of the James Bay area, if you would. But for this hunt, we've selected Algonquin Park, which is a park that doesn't allow hunting and has a healthy moose population. There is no hunting pressure, so that's going to increase our odds of Kathy getting some really good footage, we hope. Anyway, what follows is the complete canoe build, start to finish, utilizing only things we were able to take from the forest, and in my opinion, the most amazing watercraft in the world. I do believe that's my last piece of sheathing. I'm going to do a check. Yep, that's going to do it. So I've got all my pieces of sheathing now that are going to line the canoe that go underneath the ribs. I've got my ribs done. And the next thing I'm going to be working on is my thwarts. That's a good job to be finished. A bunch of wafer thin, 6 foot long to 8 foot long pieces of cedar. Good job to be done. So the reason I'm using ash is this is where the canoe's really going to get its structural integrity from. So that sort of side impact. So I've sort of got that down to the dimension I want. I've sort of rough scribed out my profile, if you would, of it. And now I got to draw that out and get it trimmed down to size. Okay, I have completed with new material. Second time I've completed it, actually. So, second set of gunnels. So this is going to be the inner gunnel, and what I've done is I've shaped it a 1-inch square. They're about 16 feet long. I'm going to be shortening them, and then I put a 45-degree bevel on the back side. So this area here, to orient it, will go this way in the canoe on the interior. So on the right wall, if you would, facing forward, and that corresponding, or that 45, I should say, the ribs are going to get a 45 cut on them. And when they're driven in, it's completely a friction fit when it's done. Anyway, pretty exciting because I'm going to start to lay this out today, and very shortly it's going to start to have a shape of a canoe. Anyway, I'm going to go over to my table and lay it out. And that is the general shape that my new canoe is going to be. I've got the outer gunnels tied to my inner gunnels, and I've fitted my front here. It's pretty close now. It'll take some final work when I get down to putting the stem piece in. It'll get thinned out a little bit on the inside here. and I've got some water boiling. So what I have to do at this point is I have to steam these guys to get them bent around so they project out a little bit, because they're going to go way up on the stem of the canoe. So I mentioned the bottom of the canoe, the shape is called the rocker. And what I'm working on now is the shear line. So the shear line, if you think of it, if your canoe's sitting upright on the water, the shear line is the shape or the profile from bow to stern of the sidelines. And this one's going to have quite a bit. That's the way the Algonquin built theirs, especially their smaller hunter canoes. So I've got the center thwart done, which sits right on the platform. I've added 1 inch here, which is starting to bring my shear line up. I've added 4 inches here. Using my measuring sticks, I'm going to carbon copy that at the far end. So I've started there. The one part I haven't finished yet, that's where the boiling water comes in, is I've got to steam these guys in order to get that final bend in the end pieces. So what I've done here is I've built a jig for the stem piece, and I'm going to see if I can make one more here. What I'm doing at this point is I'm tying off the one end that's going to be on the inside bottom of the canoe, because when I split this guy down from the top, by doing this I'll stop the split from going all the way through, because I want this portion to be solid, and I want this split into ideally about 8 pieces, but I'll settle for 6. Probably said this 100 times, but when you're splitting any wood, it's splitting it in halves. So we're going to start by finding roughly the center of this guy, and we're going to hopefully get 6 to 8 strips out of it. And then as I split it down, it's going to stop at my tie-off point. If it starts to run off, you can put pressure on the thicker part and a little bend, and ideally bring it back to center. There we go. Now I'm going to use a thinner blade for the next split. So again, I've got 2 halves, so now I'm going to split them in half. Okay, so you saw me try to bend that at the start, and now you can see how easily that's going to bend, especially once I put boiling water on, and that turned out pretty good. I'd like to get one more split in that guy, but it's not going to have much of a bend up here, and it's thin at the bottom, so where the biggest part of the bend's going to be, so I'm not going to mess with that. So I was hoping for 8, I got 4, I got 7. 7 will do it just fine. So when you think about when we harvested this, the white side was out and the inner bark was in, obviously. So when we took it off the tree, there's no way you can roll such thick bark right off the tree opposite. So we're turning it literally like taking a sock off and putting it on the other way. So we had to soak it in the lake by the area we harvested it in. And then we're able to gradually flatten it and get it rolled in this direction. So now I got to get some boiling water going, because we want to get it pliable, and that's what the water does to it. And then we're going to get this rolled out. We're going to pick the best section, cut off the surplus, and yeah, on goes the building frame. Okay, this may look a little excessive here with the rocks, but it's twofold. And there is method to my madness. Number one is I want to get a nice flat bottom in the canoe. So I've put a lot of weight on here, which is flattened out that bark with the hot water. And the next thing I'm going to do is take this beautiful piece of bark and I'm going to cut cracks in it. And I'm going to cut it all to pieces. So here we've got a natural blemish. What they're called is gores. So if you look along the canoe going forward, you see all these buckles we've got here. So what's happening, we're taking a canoe that's this wide in the middle to an actual point at either end. So it wants to buckle. So the method they use is it's called cutting gores. So we're going to cut a crack from where it's going to bend at the bottom of the building frame to the outside. And as they're folded up, they're going to overlap. And then afterwards, I'm going to cut out sort of a, if you visualize a straight cut I'm going to make, and when it's folded up, this part's going to overlap this part. Then I'm going to cut that V out, and they're just going to either get slightly overlaid, or a lot of the builders, the different native nations would actually just butt joint them. So I haven't decided on which way I'm going to go there, but the first thing I'm looking for is natural faults, if you would, in the bark, and I've got one here. So that's my first gore, and Mother Nature did that for me. It came right off the tree that way. So as I come down the canoe, there's no real math to this, and they don't have to be symmetrical. So one side can have a gore in a slightly different spot than the other, but because I've got a fairly gentle curve here, I'm going to put a gore in, and the bark's pretty good. I'm going to put a gore in right here. And you can see as I raise these pieces, you can see how this one's overlapping this one. Well, that small piece of bark will get cut out later when we try to butt those gores up. So where I'm at now is the, I got to get more boiling water. Yeah, more boiling water on this, get this bent, and get my clothespins on it. Once that's done, I'm going to be putting battens along the sides in different positions, and then these guys are going to get tied in together as we progress along once the battens are in place, and that's going to give me a nice smooth line on the outside of the canoe. And then the next step before I can sew on my side panels is I got to get inner stakes in, which are going to get tied to the inside of the outer stake. So yeah, it's starting to look like a rather agitated porcupine, but it's coming together. Okay, I've finished cutting out this gore, and you can see how I've flush mounted that. And there's the triangular piece that I took out of it. So I have to do that at every one of my gores, cut out that little triangular piece, and the next step is putting in the battens. Some might find this a tedious job, but this is an actually perfect morning. The temperature is like you almost need a coat on. We got a breeze, so there's no bugs, and I'm in the process of collecting my stitching material. So I'm in Mother Nature's warehouse, if you would. In the construction of this canoe, I'm going to need about 350 to 400 feet of root. I have built canoes that needed over 500 feet, so I'm getting off easy this time. Anyway, off to get these processed, and I'm going to actually start stitching today. Hey, you.
Hey, thought you could use some help today.
You can always use some help. Never been one to turn down help. We're going to need a lot more root.
So are you splitting it first and then peeling it, or peeling it first and then splitting it, or what?
Found splitting it first. Soaking it in that boiling water helps, and if I split it first, sometimes the bark comes off easy.
You starting at the skinny end or the fat end?
Fat end. And then watch, if you see how it's never round, so it's kind of oblong shape. So if you make your cut across the long way of it, if it happens to be a narrow root, you're going to get more. That didn't start very handy.
What if it starts sliding off center?
Now, let me just get this guy, see if I can get this guy back to center. So if it goes off center, as you're splitting it, once you've done a bit of this, you close your eyes. But you push pressure on the fat side, just like I did when I did the stem pieces for the canoe. So that gets it back to center most of the time. And then you can feel it as it goes down. So again, it's run off a bit that side, so I want to bring it back to this side, so I'm going to bend that fat side. Okay. And that's fine if you've got, I think you got most of or that one doesn't have any hair on it, but these small little root fibers, if you pluck them off first, they're like plucking a bird. You get them off first, it'll peel somewhat easier. Some you can just strip one end to the other. I don't know what it is. And then others, they really make you work for it. We're sewing the side panels on now, and I'm using a saddle stitch. And this bark is awful thick, which is good. I mean, it's going to be a durable canoe. But what I'm essentially doing is, so I've got two threads, and I'm putting one through, and I'm bringing the second one out the same hole. So to make the initial hole, I use a three-sided awl. And the reason I don't use a drill, if I use a drill, I remove the material in the bark. And so when it all dries up, shrinks down, tightens up, if I use the awl, I'm not removing fiber that the drill would do. So the first hole goes through with a triangular awl. In order to get the second bark through, I can't use this one to enlarge the hole because it would cut the first thread. So I use a round awl to enlarge the hole, which I'm going to do now and start. And then once the side panels are done, I will be dissecting my gunnels, taking the outer gunnels off, setting the inner gunnels in, and getting my shear line. I may be a little shy of bark, so I may have to take a little bit of the shear out that I initially planned on, but we'll see how that goes. So I'll demonstrate a little closer here what I'm talking about. So I've got two threads or roots, and so this one's passed through from the outside. Now I'm bringing this one and passing it through the same hole from the inside. So essentially, well, it's called a saddle stitch, and it's a strong stitch, and it's easy to waterproof when I'm all finished. So. And at the start of it, what I've done is I've locked in the two existing threads here. This guy I'll be able to cut off after and tighten that up a little bit. But essentially that's what we're going to do the entire length of the side panel. And like I said, once that's done, the fun part starts, because we set the gunnels in, we find that gunnel line, start trimming the bark down, and we start sewing it all together. And yeah, before you know it, it'll be floating. So now I'm taking the inner one, passing it through the same hole, to the outside. Everything wiggles and wobbles and it looks like it's fragile as heck, but when this is all done, you flip this guy over, you'll be able to take a baseball bat or a canoe paddle or stick to the bottom of it, and you simply can't damage them. They are a very strong craft. I think I mentioned in an earlier video, with the exception of the bow and the stern. And the reason for that is we're not able to get a rib bent tight enough to get right in the very apex, if you would, of the front and the end of the canoe. So, but overall, a very strong craft when it's done. Next stitch. This is a slow process, a really slow process. It's got to be about the journey and not the destination when it comes to canoe building. But it will float someday. And yet more rocks. Rocks are a canoe builder's best friend. So I've got my inner gunnels in, and I've got shear posts that they sit on, which establish the line of the shear. And I was able to actually correct the front and back, so I've got enough bark now both ends without having to make new short thwarts here. So the next step I'm at right now is I've got all the shear posts in except this end. So what I'm looking for, this end's got to come up quite a bit, something like so. And this weight will help keep that shear line. So we're looking for symmetry, front to back, side to side, and we're pretty much there. So I got to make one shear post. Well, we got a bunch of stuff happening now, and it's actually starting to look like a canoe. A lot of hours in, but you're starting to see the general shape of it. So I'm driving the stakes back in, tying them off to keep that symmetry front to back. And now I'm starting to cut down my excessive bark and driving the wooden square peg in a round hole. And wherever you see a peg, that will be a lashing. So lashing there, lashing there, lashing there, and in between will be rib, 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 full length of the canoe. And a whole lot of root gathering and a whole lot of stitching. But it's starting to take shape. So the first thing I do is I take my knife and I take the widest part of the lacing and I put a small flat spot on it. And then I take my wooden pegs that I've driven in and I drive them back out. First you build it, that loosens up the gunnel. And then where my lashing goes, insert my knife and I spread apart the gunnel from the bark. So when I get it spread out enough that I can insert the root, that's perfect. Next step is to nail it back again. So once I've driven that back in, I've got that anchored pretty good. And the next step is to cut off the wooden pegs. So all the wooden pegs on the side of the canoe are going to get hidden by the lashing. Point out too that, so when we split it, if we get a close look here, we've got a flat side and we got a bottom side. So the rounded side is always going to be on the outside of the canoe, and the flat side goes against my inner and outer gunnels. So I get a nice tight fit. That's why we split them. That's why we don't use them round, and it gives us a nice strong lash. So at this point, I'm going to put a little point on the end of my sewing thread, for lack of a better word. I want it stiff enough and thin enough that it's going to go through the small holes that I'm going to make. 3 holes that I will, with my triangular awl. Again, I'm not removing fiber, I'm just kind of pushing it aside. And once the root dries out, it's just like it's nailed or screwed together. So in through the hole, flat side against the bark. I'm going to go 3 times through. The first one kind of really locks that guy in. And we get that nice and flat, and we pull the first one through. Now at this point, if I have to awl again in that same hole, I don't. Root's fairly small. I'll use the round awl. That way I don't cut the previous thread. So that's my second pass through. Round awl to just enlarge that just enough to get the lace through. So that's my third pass through. Triangular awl, second hole. I'm trying to keep that up as tight both to the inner and the outer gunnel to the bottom as possible so I don't rip out my bark. Now on the inside, I'm going to lock it off with the last 2 wraps. So I got to go through this hole twice. So what I'm going to do is not tighten this down this time. I'm going to leave a little slack here. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. So there's the tail end of the thing. So I'm going to pass it back through the previous 2 loops. And it's going to get hidden down underneath here when I'm all said and done. You won't see this, and that tail will get cut off. Then I go back to finding my first one, which is this guy, and working it back. And that's one of the 2 loops. And that one's finished. And we cut off the tail. And we have one more lashing done, and I don't know, 50 some to go. Well, maybe not quite 50. It's coming along. This is pretty neat because since I started the build, this hasn't been movable, and now that I can move it about and start working on my end pieces, it's one step closer to floating.
So I mentioned when I first started constructing the thwarts that I used measuring sticks. So it's really flat bottomed now, and once the ribs are driven in, it's going to be much deeper here. So an average canoe is 12 to 13 inches. So I've got about 9 inches here to here. And when I'm finished driving the ribs in, I'm going to have about a 12 to a 13 inch deep canoe in the middle. The shallowest part, if you would, a little bit deeper bow and stern. And yeah, that transformation, for me, it's the epitome of canoe building when I finally get down to driving those ribs in, and also the scariest part, because you don't want to blow out at that point. So you have to be pretty careful, and we'll be demonstrating that. I have never worked with as thick a bark as this, so you can, this thing here is about better than a quarter of an inch, and that's the kind of bark I'm dealing with, which is going to be a rugged canoe. But anyway, so I've got the far end stitched, and I'm working on this end now, stitching. So this stitch at the top is above waterline, so it's not going to get pitched. From here down, I'm going to do a next stitching on following the gunnel line, following the stem line, and that's the part that'll get pitched because that'll be below water. Okay, so I'm not cooking supper here. What I'm doing is I'm rendering down spruce gum. So spruce gum is the primary component of the pitch we're going to use. So we're going to boil it once, and we're going to strain it, and then we're going to boil it a second time, strain it a second time. Anyway, the next step here is I'm going to take it over and I'm going to add a little bit of bear fat to it. So if we just use this straight up on the canoe, when it cures and hardens, it'll be brittle and it'll crack. So we need to add a bit of bear fat to it to make it more malleable. We don't want to add too much, because if we add too much fat, it'll run off in the sun in the really warm weather. So it's a fine line, and we're going to add just a little bit at a time, and do a wee bit of an experiment to ensure that it's going to work on the canoe. See, I'm actually able to bend that, and you can see it's not cracking at all. It's staying. That's my bark cracking, but the pitch isn't. So we've pretty much got the texture we want. And that's going to seal the canoe up really good. The reason I taper these down, like really taper them off, is that's going to overlap the previous piece that I put in, the long piece, and we don't want a bulge there. So when the ribs drive in, we want a really smooth platform, if you would, or floor of the canoe. I have the sheathing all fitted into the canoe now, and it was an exercise in patience, to say the least. What I've done at this point is I've laid all my ribs out in the position they're going to go, and I've marked both sides, and those pencil marks are going to be my bend marks. So I think these have been in the water about long enough.
Today's the moment of truth. We're going to be driving our ribs, and it amazes me that the indigenous people had it all figured out. No screws, no nail, no glues. They use compression and tension, and it's all going to be held that together that way. So this is the hardest gunnel to make. I've broke a couple already this morning trying to dry fit them. This one I think is going to work. So what I do is I taper down the sides, and then I put a 45 on them, and then I put a 45 on the top right here. And basically what that does, on the inside of the inner gunnel, there's a 45-degree bevel the entire length of that gunnel. And it corresponds with this 45. So as it's driven in, it's just that compression and tension that's gonna hold this together. Anyway, first rib. What I do at this point is I mark the top of the gunnel. And it's actually going to be, when it's driven in, that rib's going to be an inch lower on both sides. And that's going to expand the bark and push the bark out at the bottom. And that's why we're putting the boiling water on everything. So we've got to keep everything soaked. There's a huge amount of stress put on the lacing as the ribs are being driven in, and the bark. So if we keep everything really well wetted down, it lets that expand. Last one's a little tricky. I had to make an extra one because I broke them. Anyway, this one should work. But now I'm in a position where I have to offset them quite a bit like this in order to drive them in. So I've driven them in, now I'm going to drive them back out. So I got to drive out 2 or 3 here, hopefully just 2 partially, and maybe 1 that way. Anyway, it's a bit of finicky work to get the last guy in. Voila. That's 1 ribbed canoe. So yeah, I'm gonna let this guy dry out for a few days, and then we're pitching it. Then we're gonna put the top gunnel, or the caps on the gunnels, and yeah, we're off for a maiden voyage. It's been a bit of a haul. This may look a little rude, me spitting on my finger, but what it does, it allows me to form it and push it in between the threads or the stitching, the root stitching, and I can form it and it doesn't stick to my finger. Otherwise I'd have a gob on it, I don't know, size of my fist. Almost there.
Just the gores.
Just the gores and the bow and the stern, and I think we need more spruce gum. The last, and I mean the very last piece of lacing that needed on this canoe. So basically I'm just lashing because my inner gunnel's too thin there to put in my square peg. I'd split it out, so I'm lacing the two gunnel caps just at the very bow and stern, and yeah, last one.